Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. I'm Sharif here with Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, welcome. How are you doing?
Doing well, Sharif. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Yeah, ready to talk about some important topics and just to dive right in and see what we come up with. So, the broad outline for the discussion was to talk about perfectionism, which
That's right.
is kind of a big thing now. I don't know, how long has it been around kind of in the history of psychology? Is it a new concept or?
I think it is. It's something mostly commented on in the last, say, 30 years in psychology. Maybe even the beginnings of it about 50, 60 years ago. But it's a relatively new kind of way of thinking about problematic behaviors.
And it also, I don't know, it seems like kind of one that's also a common term now is that, I don't know, it's common to just call people a perfectionist or to refer to yourself as a perfectionist. So it's kind of something that people commonly diagnose other people with or self-diagnose with. So it's that maybe gives the sense that it's not as much of like a rigorous term in psychology, but I don't know if, but is it in fact?
Yeah, is it even a bad thing? I mean, I think people often call themselves a perfectionist. You could kind of imagine someone in a job interview saying, like, what's your biggest defect? And they say, oh, I'm a perfectionist. Because it's probably not seen as being super bad as far as issues go. But I think it's actually debilitating. And in some ways, what we do in optimal work is the antidote to perfectionism.
So, okay, so then maybe it makes sense to just start by getting very clear on what perfectionism is, because maybe some people mean different things by it. I think that, I mean, I've kind of been referred to as a perfectionist or sometimes consider myself a perfectionist. I think like what you were saying was like, it's kind of a way of being disparaging about yourself, but at the same time kind of complimenting yourself. But like, what is it really? I mean, I think sometimes it's just thrown around to kind of as a label for people who have high standards or who do good work. So,
That's what a lot of people think that.
Perfectionist.
Exactly, they think that just because you have high standards, you're necessarily a perfectionist. So, I think that basically, if you look at the definitions of perfectionism used in psychology, they all have this idea in common that somehow when your self-worth depends on arbitrarily high goals being attained. So like there's a sense that somehow if you arbitrarily set these higher and higher goals and then your self-worth depends on it. I actually really don't like that definition or that style of defining because if you think about it deeply, okay, so there's two elements. One is that there's like your self-worth depending too much on something. And then there's this idea that you can have goals that are arbitrarily too high. And both of those are perfectionistic because it means that in fact there is a perfect level of self-worth you're supposed to have. And then there's a perfect level of goal setting you're supposed to have. And anything off, those, two kind of criteria, then is like you're in danger of becoming a perfectionist. So you'd actually have to be a perfectionist to meet that standard. So it doesn't seem to me that it's helpful at all. I don't think the goal is having the perfectly calibrated sense of self-worth so that you have like the accurate sense of self-worth. Because what would that even mean? So I don't think that's actually a real concept.
Yeah. So what is self-worth? I mean,
it's somehow how you evaluate yourself. And so it's like having the perfectly tuned in sense of self-esteem or self-confidence. I think it's super murky. So I think that a much better kind of way of approaching it is to say fundamentally, in all the different ways you could describe people being perfectionists, what do they all have in common? And so I think of perfectionism as just a pattern of behavior that arises from seeing imperfection as a threat. That if you really feel threatened by imperfection, okay, then you're going to have certain behaviors that result from it. And you should be able to identify where somehow the behaviors are exaggerated. because you're doing too much, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid making mistakes, to avoid imperfection. So I think that like example, like that these different like examples I would think of. One is, when like over preparing for things. So this can happen a lot. Even like really good students, will spend way too much time on an assignment or on preparing for some presentation. Or you think of like a person spending days getting the house clean because they're going to be having friends over. So like just overdoing the preparation of, that seems to be a hallmark of a certain kind of perfectionist.
Yeah, and it all seems to be aimed at, well, it's there's a kind of sense in which it's just very detail focused.
Yep.
And that you're kind of trying to make sure there are no gaps somewhere, like no mistakes, no errors, like you were saying. Like for like the person who over cleans is like, okay, they want, it's very detail oriented, no kind of spots in the house that are dirty. The student who's over studying, like, I want to make sure that there are absolutely no kind of gaps in my knowledge.
Exactly.
I have to make sure that there, or a common example that I used to do when I was in college and writing more was to like pore over my papers over and over again just to make sure there weren't any typos. Would you say that's a perfectionistic tendency?
Yeah, as far as a tendency goes, if typos became too big a focus for you because you're afraid of making them, maybe there were other ways you could have been growing in writing papers. But this is the real issue with perfectionism, is that it really inhibits growth. And if a person were only to be focusing on avoiding typos, then he or she wouldn't be developing better ways of learning to express themselves and how to make better arguments and the higher skills that go into writing papers. So I think that you hit on another really good example of the behaviors people have to prevent imperfection or mistakes, and it's hyper-focus on details. And that's very common among all types of perfectionists, is that they kind of get obsessed with certain details, but they can lose sight of the big picture. You could imagine like a person checking a paper again and again, and then they actually don't get it turned in on time. Well, their grade may suffer much more from not having turned it in, on time than it would from, having missed that one last typo. And maybe the broadest category in some way of perfectionistic behaviors is reassurance seeking. That people are trying to reassure themselves that something is good enough. And so they keep on wanting the satisfaction of more and more perfect outcomes so that they can be more fully reassured that everything is okay.
So like after, say, a performance, they might ask their friend or their colleague or their boss, like, okay, hey, was that good? Was that good enough? Did I do okay?
Yep.
So they just want to know that they didn't make any big mistakes. Is that what you're saying?
I think so, yeah. So they always want to be comforted that they didn't make a big mistake. But it even affects how people grow. I was just talking with someone about this, someone who I really enjoy talking to, about how to improve in tennis. And this person is admittedly a perfectionist. And his way of improving in tennis was to minimize the number of times the ball hits the net. Which makes sense. You would think as you're getting better at tennis, if there's a trajectory of growth, maybe it's 50% of the time when you first start, and then then it goes down and down to finally it's like less than 1% of the time. So I think that is, in my mind, a perfect example of how perfectionists set goals for growth. It's always about somehow getting rid of the imperfection and lessening it, and they would get reassured then as they started meeting these goals that, okay, I am in fact getting better in playing tennis. Now, I like that example because it really captures perfectly, like if you want to improve in your tennis game, keeping the eye on the net is not a good idea. You want to, and it's like that focus on, getting outcomes and then ever more perfectly, free of error, like more flawless outcomes. That to me is the whole problem. The process is what you should be aiming at shaping, not the outcome. And the process would be, for instance, something like keeping your eye on the ball as you make contact with it, keeping your head still as your body as it makes contact with the ball, as the racket makes contact. Now those don't pay off right away in terms of better outcomes. So initially, when you're just keeping the eye on the ball as you make contact with it, you could be hitting the net more. But the better you get at doing that, eventually, because you're focusing on the right process of how you grow and establishing a really solid foundation, you end up being able to, to hit the net less and less. But hitting the net is kind of an irrelevant thing. Keeping the eye on the ball, well, okay, that's what the pros do, and you'll see. And not moving your head as you make contact, that's what the pros do. And that's actually a super helpful skill. And in all the kind of sports and everything you're learning, it's important to see what's the real process of getting better look like here? What's the real process of growth? And not to worry about the outcomes as long as you're engaging that.
Yeah, and then another aspect of it that we've kind of touched on is the idea of having negative goals for things. Like to not make such and such a mistake. Whereas I always remember a piece of advice that you gave me of when you're giving people feedback to not necessarily to like avoid negative things, but just to kind of focus on the opportunities that are presented. So like focus on the positive. Like you can really improve your public speaking skills if you change the pitch of your voice throughout the conversation, throughout the talk, as opposed to saying something like, "Oh, you're really flat the whole talk." So just that kind of positive way of framing things. Does that have anything to do with what we're talking about here? Because it seems like the perfectionist is kind of having these sorts of negative goals of no typos, no dirty areas of the house, no no failures from hitting the ball into the net. How does that fit in that negative focus?
I think that's a great insight that perfectionists tend to have, and not that there are people who are like permanently perfectionists, but that's just a shorthand for saying people who in that moment are displaying this kind of perfectionistic behavior. What's happening is they are trying to stamp out a negative. And this can happen with themselves or it can be applied to other people. I think that we should be very wary of ourselves if our idea of helping others is stamping out the negative in them. And as if to really help people, you have to really ponder their negative qualities and then just completely annihilate that. That would be a bad approach to helping others to grow. So one element is that, yes, the question is, what do you want to see more of? How would you put it in a positive way? But even that could still not be enough, I think, right? Because it could be that, okay, what if the right goal, what if the person says, well, okay, then I'm going to focus on getting the ball over the net more and more % of the time. Does that take care of it? No, because they're still focused on an outcome, even a positive outcome. It's still, they're not working on the process by which they grow. So to work on the process is the key. Always trying to see how can I get better at doing this kind of thing? And what are the real things, not measurable, tangible things, but in terms of the actual skill I'm bringing to it. But I think this is getting into that when there's the left brain fixation on outcome. And then it's always going to have this negative processing bias that comes with it of just trying to get rid of all imperfection. But the process goal is going to feel different because the real positive content is always some form of a bond. So a bond with other persons. And I think that the way you really grow yourself is by prioritizing bonds over outcomes, prioritizing the actual people in your life and the centrality of those bonds in your life versus just getting certain outcomes met, even positive outcomes.
One of the things that I think is difficult about defining perfectionism is kind of how do you draw the line between what's excessive focus on these details or these outcomes and what's a kind of more healthy thing. So it's good to make sure that your work is high quality, but then where's the line that it becomes perfectionism? So you're saying that precisely the way that you draw that line is by whether it's helping the bonds or harming the bonds of the people closest to you in your life.
I think that's exactly right. Because ultimately, work is not an end in itself. It's a series of outcomes that should be means to an end. But others in your life are ends in themselves. And the bond is how you serve them. The bond is how you show, it's how you actually like bring goodness into the world, is really your bonds with others. So that, yeah, we want people to learn how to bring ideals into their work so that they're shaping it, so that they're being, more patient, more kind, more understanding, ultimately more able to love and serve others. But that's the whole point, is it's actually oriented towards loving and serving others. And so if you're giving a presentation, let's say you're giving a presentation on optimal work to a group of people that has not been exposed to these, any ideas before. Does it really matter that the fonts are perfect, or even that your voice modulation is perfect? Like if a person were to, those are all means to serving people. But if you get over-focused on the means, then you turn them into ends in themselves. And then it could be that you would just get focused on a perfect delivery. Well, that has to serve the people you're speaking to. What you're really wanting to do is to help them to discover new things, to get enthused with ability to grow and how to actually make that growth happen. So there's like a wonderful thing that you could be doing just to serve them. So if you're dealing with others, you think, how can I really provide them the best service? That would be then a solid freedom from perfectionism.
I mean, so the perfectionist is kind of, in a sense, challenging themselves in each hour of work. The problem is that they're just not doing it according to their highest ideals.
Yes.
If you, just coming back to this idea of giving a talk, because I would think, okay, like I want to turn this talk into a golden hour, so I need some way of challenging myself. So I'm going to challenge myself to, give come up with good examples, or to, make my presentation more engaging by having an interesting intro and conclusion or something like that. But now, so you're saying that, well, all of that has to be kind of put into the context of serving the people. So the challenge has to further that ultimate end. And that's what prevents it from becoming just this sort of perfectionism. So it actually seems like perfectionism is, like, understanding this is actually kind of fundamental to avoiding a real misunderstanding in OptimalWork's approach, which is that we're not just challenging ourselves to become kind of more perfectionistic or something like that. So is that, in your experience, a common, misunderstanding that people have with regards to OptimalWork, is like thinking that it's furthering that perfectionistic tendency, when in fact they're just missing that point, that the challenge has to be for the sake of service, and that would actually help them undo the perfectionism?
Yeah, so I think it's all, in a sense, about, if people think that good work, is an end in itself, then they're going to not be able to understand a golden hour, or they're not going to be able to understand reframing. Because ultimately, when you get deeper and deeper into reframing, it's like asking, in the big picture, in the ultimate, context, widest context, how is this an opportunity for me to love and serve others? Because, yes, it's an opportunity for me to grow, but even that should be a way of then being able to give our best to those around us. That in the end, it has to be transcending oneself. So you transcend yourself by really giving your best to those around you. And that gives us then the standard by which to judge our outcomes, which is, are they good enough? So if you're giving a talk and you're really trying to serve the people in the audience, your voice modulation has to be good enough to not impede getting your point across. The slides you use, they have to be good enough. But they're not ends in themselves. They're good enough to serve the end. So, if you're trying to get the house clean because you're going to be having, friends over. Well, what's good enough to show that you are caring for your friends? Obviously, there are some things that the house were so dirty, it'd be kind of insulting. It's like, oh, they didn't spend a second, but there is like a level at which it's good enough. So the only way to assess, like, what's good enough in terms of means is, are they really still serving the end? And so there is a sense in which you have to, like, have order. Order is always about materializing ideals, about taking things and then saying, okay, the end I'm seeking is really this, and then making sure all the steps are leading there so that the means are put right. And that's so that you desire the best for the people around you. That's actually the ultimate standard then on, are your efforts good enough? Well, if you're growing in some way, if you're stretching yourself with the goals you set, then you are going to be more able to actually be available for others. You're going to be more able to do good for others in your life. And that's the ultimate meaning, that's the ultimate end.
Yeah, Kevin, that's super helpful. I think I have a lot of new ideas for how I'm going to challenge myself this week. So to just put these things in the context of service, it's just super helpful.
I think service is the solution to perfectionism. Yeah.
That's really cool. That's all our time for today, though. I don't know, Kevin, it seems like you're kind of bursting with ideas. Do you have some final thoughts that you wanted to add?
Only that once you have the right end in mind of really providing the best service, now you can really think about how to concretely stretch yourself. And that aiming for that concrete stretch, because that is like the optimal view of growth, is how can I in this next hour really stretch myself to grow so that I can serve, versus the perfectionist idea of growth, which is how do I minimize errors?
Awesome. Ending with the contrast of perfectionist and optimal. I love it.
Exactly. That's the distinction.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for sharing
Sharif.
all these insights. We'll be back next week.